Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. Today's session is going to be the first of many as part of our election SOS project. And the point of this project, the goal of this project, is to educate journalists and help better prepare journalists as we get closer to November, so they can be better prepared to cover the election. So our first session today, which is the first session or one of the first sessions of this series, is called Reporting on Elections from an Election Administrator's Perspective. And so with this, we really wanted to connect journalists with someone who has been doing this kind of work for a very, very long time, and who can answer, some of the deeper questions that people may have about covering voting and elections. So today we're going to focus on a couple things. We're going to focus on what do journalists need to know about their reporting when they talk about voter registration, and we're going to talk about voter access as well. And we have the perfect person here to do it, who is Tammy Patrick. She is a senior advisor for the Democracy Fund's elections program. A couple things about Tammy: she's had a great career. She's been doing this work for so long and in so many different places. She was a local election official for more than a decade in Arizona. She was appointed by President Obama to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And some of her biggest focus areas are vote by mail, absentee ballots, voting assistance, language access, and that's just a few of the things that she is really, really smart about, and has really been focusing on over these years. So the point of this session is to learn from Tammy today and hear what she has to say. But part of what we're doing with this program is that you all will have access to Tammy and her expertise and her knowledge as we get closer to November. So our relationship with you all extends beyond this 1 hour session that we have today. But I'm gonna be quiet, and I am gonna let Tammy go ahead and take it away and get started.
Great. Thanks so much, John. So I am thrilled to be here today because I love to talk about elections and election administration, and I can talk about it all day long, but we're going to keep it condensed just to this hour. So, reporting on elections, there are a few things that I like to talk about when we think about reporting on elections and the role that journalists play in this moment, particularly. And so today I want to really do a brief, big picture analysis, talk about some ideas of sources and stories and things to cover in this moment that are beyond the horse race of it all, and then break it into pre-election day and voter registration, election day kind of coverage and things to think about there, post-election day, and then I have a slew of resources at the end that that I'm going to just touch on really briefly to give you some ideas of other areas where you can find additional information outside of kind of the fire hose brain dump that is going to be this presentation. First of all, I like to say very often that every election has a story to tell. You say Florida, and you know the story. 2016, and suddenly we're all talking about cybersecurity and foreign influence. And sometimes we don't know what that story is until long after the ballots are counted. But this year, we pretty much know it's going to be about COVID. But the question will be, to what degree, to what extent is it going to influence the elections? And will it just change 2020 and participation, or is this a sea change, a major shift in the way in which voters vote in the United States? For those of you on the call, some of you maybe have been covering elections for a long time. Some of you, you might be new to the elections beat. Either way, it almost doesn't matter because elections change so frequently that every election is like a new election. And so one of the things that I want to mention that I think is really critical in this moment is knowing what's right so you can really tell what's wrong. And what I mean by that is if you get a tip, someone sends you a video of a voting machine flipping a vote or changing the way in which a vote was registered, and you're in a state, knowing if that piece of equipment is even used in your state is really helpful. If you're a national reporter, you have a much greater challenge. It's also important to know that sometimes Wednesday actually is election day. So this is an example from Rhode Island where their election day was Wednesday, September 12th. And that's kind of a traditional voter suppression tactic that we see sometimes. You know, Democrats vote on Wednesday, Republicans are vote on Tuesday, or vice versa. Sometimes everybody votes on Wednesday. So we can't make an assumption that elections are always Tuesday. If you cover Louisiana, elections are on Saturday there. So it's really important. Also in this moment, you know, words, of course, that's your job, right? You work in words. In this moment, voters really are listening, and that's where we need to be really cognizant of using trigger words, flag words that can have unintended consequences. And some of that comes around when we talk about elections and what words we use to refer to different processes and procedures. So there's voter registration and election management systems, and then there are also voting systems. So when you think about voting equipment, what is that? Is it the electronic poll book that's used to sign in the voter? Is it the ballot on demand printer in some cases? So this is a vote center or voter service center in Denver, Colorado, and they print up the ballot that's specific to the voter when they check in. Is that voting equipment? Is the ballot marking device that's used to mark the paper ballot the voting equipment? Or is it the tabulator that's counting the ballot? All of this is important, as we've seen most recently in Georgia. When we talk about voting equipment, which of these pieces are we talking about? And it makes a big difference because each of them play a very different role in the process. I think it's also really important to consider your criteria for who is an expert. For all reasons, and what are their motivations? Are they an expert because they've been cited in some other articles or some as a source in other areas, or do they have actual accreditation? And I think that that's an important moment because particularly when we talk about the security of elections and the access for elections, what are individuals' motivations for the way that they're speaking, and how do we get the best story? So I immediately turned to Pam Fessler and said, okay, in this moment, I'm going to be talking to a bunch of journalists, and you've been covering the elections for a long time. What's your recommendation? And you can see here, she's like, talk to as many people as possible. And I really think that that needs to be taken to heart. And always there should be some election administrator in there because they can oftentimes debunk or explain something that maybe seems really odd, maybe steeped in some obscure statutory requirement or have some other procedural reason behind it. Because it really is so much more than a horse race. So let's talk about elections in general across the country. There are more than 10,000 election jurisdictions conducting elections in the United States. They have a lot of different titles. So if you're covering, your market is one state, it's pretty good because then you just need to find out, is it a supervisor of elections in Florida? Is it a clerk in Colorado? Is it a county auditor in Iowa? Or if you're covering the national landscape, how do we make sure that we're talking about these things in the right way? So knowing that it's the probate judges that do voter registration in a certain area is an important element to making sure that the story resonates and rings true. There's a report, and I should say one caveat here. So as John mentioned, I've been in this field for almost 20 years, so old, almost 20 years. And I serve on, I'm going to share a lot of information with you here. I serve on many of their boards, for full disclosure. I work at Democracy Fund, and many of the individuals and organizations I'm going to talk about are in fact grantees of Democracy Fund. I've only been at Democracy Fund for the last couple of years, so but I wanted to make sure you get all of the best information as I see it. And one of the pieces is a study that we did at Democracy Fund. It's an ongoing study of local election officials. And when we think about that landscape of 10,000 election officials, what this chart is really demonstrating is that the size of the jurisdiction is really important. So almost 60% of our jurisdictions in this country are less than 5,000 voters. They service 3% of our electorate. Whereas the largest jurisdictions, over 250,000 voters, are only 2% of our election officials, but they service more than half of our voters. And that can be really important because when you think about resources, you think about, the job is the same, right? You register voters, you get them a ballot, you count their ballots, you do all of these things. They are given a wide variety of resources. So on the one hand, you see the storage facility, we'll call it, of Ramsey County, Minnesota. And on the right-hand side is Los Angeles County. There's a big difference there. But in general, everyone's doing these same kind of tasks. So when we think about before the election, these are some items that would be ideas for stories. So how do people get on the ballot, or where are our voting sites going to be? Election day, how are votes being counted? Post-election day, how do we certify ballots? What's taking so long? That sort of thing. The other impact for those smaller jurisdictions, and what we're looking at here is the dark bar shows the response that all or almost all of their job duties are elections. So we see in those small jurisdictions, the amount of their job duty that is actually conducting the election is very small. They have a lot of other jobs that they do, and that in and of itself can be a story. So in Colorado, one of the other jobs is thawing out the cemetery when there needs to be a funeral. It could be dog licenses, marriage licenses, all sorts of things. But everybody, no matter what size jurisdiction they're from, have to adhere to the same federal laws, and then there's all those ever-changing state laws. So there's a lot on their plates, and there's a lot to think about. We talked a little bit about media markets and the language being used and how we can make sure that we're reducing any kind of voter confusion when we're reporting on things. And I'm going to just say that a second time because it really is critical, particularly in areas where the way in which voters can vote and the voting options are dramatically different. So I'm in Maryland, so we've got Maryland, DC, and Virginia, and not everybody can request a ballot by mail. Not everybody can go early and vote in person in those 3 states, but yet we're all watching the same television channels out of DC and out of Baltimore. So let's talk about some sources and some stories. One thing that I found to be very interesting, and it kind of rocked my world, because election officials think that voters think about, I need to register to vote, then I need to find out where I'm going to vote, how I'm going to vote, and I need to go and vote. And that's absolutely wrong. So the Center for Civic Design did a study, and what they found that matters the most to voters, the very first thing is, do I care? Do I care what's on this ballot? What is on the ballot? What are my options in voting? Can I vote early? Can I vote by mail? What do I need to bring? Do I need ID? What does that look like? Do I have that ID? And then the very last thing they think about is, am I registered to vote? Now, the reason I always bring this particular study up is that in many cases, once the voter gets to this part of, am I registered to vote, it's too late. They're after the registration deadline. So talking about these things and having the stories on them early on in the cycle can really be beneficial to our electorate. Sources, because I mentioned you should always talk to state and local election officials. The secretaries of state, nas.org, and state elections directors, NASED, both have all of the state's representatives on their websites. And then when you go to that secretary's website, oftentimes it has all of the local officials, all of the counties, and what have you listed there. And then the EAC is the Election Assistance Commission. So they are the federal agency that's tasked with kind of supporting elections at the federal level. You're going to notice as I go through all my slides here, of which there are probably a few too many, there's a lot of social media. Following local election officials is a great source for video content, for photographs, for commentary, and really triggers and additional notification of things that are going on. Many of the best offices will, of course, have media packets that you can oftentimes just get right off their websites. And there are a few different events that I bring up here because we're not sure what COVID's going to mean in this regard. So here is a naturalization ceremony. So what a great story of new Americans registering to vote as they become new citizens in the United States. Some great photographs you can get there. I took this one at the Sandra Day O'Connor Federal Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona, when I was an official there. The question, though, is what does that mean in this moment? How is COVID impacting naturalization and the registration of voters there? How is it affecting voter outreach events where traditionally people get registered, update their registrations? Those events are not happening in this moment. So how is that affecting registration? I always have to include this photograph because it was taken at the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community 10 years ago. So I'm assuming that at this point, the older sister is now able to really register and vote because she was, I think, 8 or 9 at the time. And there are oftentimes stories that we can talk about with engaging of young people, student poll workers, kids voting activities, and things like that that can be a way of engaging our younger voters. And then lastly on this piece is many jurisdictions, of course, have language requirements under the Voting Rights Act to provide information in alternative languages. There are some amazingly beautiful, rich stories to be told there. This is from a language summit that was put on in Alaska a couple of years ago. And it was just a great way of finding how they're keeping some of the languages alive through ballot language and the mechanisms of voting. And then the last piece that I think is really a unifying thread through all of this is through the lack of resources. So the 0.54 is the percent of a county budget that is ascribed to an elections office. This was a study out of Auburn University by Professors Hale and Professor Brown of election center members. An election center is the National Association of Local Election Officials. And so this is actually on the high end for those election offices because election center members tend to be medium and larger sized jurisdictions. They have the resources to participate in election center. And even there in those counties and those jurisdictions, their election office budget is half of 1% of the county's budget as a whole. And that's why you see things like the picture on the left. In St. Louis County, they made things out of PVC pipe. Those are the racks that carry the ballot or the voting booths, and they roll those in and out to go to the polling places and what have you, but they couldn't afford, pre-made ones, so they literally made them themselves out of PVC. There's a whole coffee table book on the use of PVC in elections that I'm going to do when I retire, if that ever happens. So pre-election day, who's on the ballot? How does someone get on the ballot? How does someone get nomination petitions signed in this COVID moment when we're not having county fairs, when we're not going to the farmer's market? And in often many places, you have to get a wet signature. You can't do an online application or an online petition. So there's a story there. Always litigation. There's going to be, we've already seen it starting, right? All of the litigation through the primaries. And will vote by mail applications be mailed out? Will ballots be mailed out? Will postmarks work? What will the time frame be that ballots can be returned? How many polling places will there be? All of these things are really ripe for additional changes. And when those changes occur, it creates chaos and uncertainty for the voters. So having stories about what's happening is going to be really timely. Also, there's a great way to get, build relationships with your local and state elections offices, because many of them will have press conferences and we'll have people come in. It's a great time to get B-roll footage of ballot processing and other procedures that are happening. There's the logic and accuracy test where jurisdictions test all of the equipment, and that's a great time to get some shots there to use later on. Many particularly large jurisdictions have command centers, which is kind of the hub of their hotlines on election day. And what's important there is that some of them have special viewing set up for the media. So this is Chicago. Chicago has a separate room where the screens that you see here, the media have exact access to all of the reports coming in from out in the field. That is something that a lot of them don't do, but some do. So you can always ask. I also, I include this picture. This is Alice. I worked with Alice when I was in Maricopa County. I'm actually in this room. We were processing 122,000 provisional ballots that year. So I'm off shot here, but I bring this up because if you Google provisional ballots, this photograph of Alice has been used all over the country. And so when you don't have your own pictures, when you don't have the representation of what's happening in your state and in your jurisdiction, then you get Alice. And it's important for voters to say, oh, that looks like the provisional ballot box where I dropped my provisional ballot, not that doesn't look like anything that I'm familiar with. So it's really important to get those pictures, the right shots. Using an old lever machine is not the right shot for talking about cyber meddling and new voting equipment. And again, this is kind of back to, you know, what's right helps you to know what's wrong. In this ever-changing moment, knowing the options available to voters is going to be really, really critical, because we know that's going to be changing. But we also know that we shouldn't be making any assumptions on how voters are going to interact. So voter registration. There's a lot being discussed right now around voter registration, around the fact that it's leveled off at the Department of Motor Vehicles. So we're not getting updates from people going in to, you know, renew their licenses, that sort of thing. We know that voter outreach efforts are not going out and being able to engage with the public. And that's going to have a big impact on polling place notification cards when a polling place change is being mailed out to someone, or a ballot application. It all starts with those voter rolls. And so that's going to be something that I know election officials are focusing on. But in this COVID moment, they're also having a big reduction in their own budgets. I've heard everywhere from 10% to 20% budget reductions in a moment where they have additional costs. They have PPE that they need to purchase and all these other things. So it's going to be really foundational. But the good news there is that there are some policies like pre-registration. In Florida, when you get your driver's license at 16, you can check off you want to register to vote when you turn 18. And supervisors of elections in Florida register hundreds of voters every day that pre-registered before they turned 18. So there are policies like that, policies like automated or automatic voter registration, online voter registration, being a member of the Electronic Registration Information Center, or because that's a mouthful, we refer to it, it says ERIC. All of these policies, these states are going to be better positioned in this COVID moment. And so there's some, some good news there in support of making some of those modernization efforts, because we know that voters don't necessarily understand voter registration. 40% of Americans don't know they have to update their voter registration when they move. And that's a real problem. Even when a state has something like online voter registration, 1 in 4 voters said that they didn't have, and this was a CCS survey. I realize I don't have the citation on the slide, but 1 in 4 voters said they didn't have online registration, but they did. And also we know that half the voters who said they didn't know have online voter registration. So interjecting some of these messages into stories is really helpful, because it helps to inform the public. I like to include this photograph because a few of us were in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia a few years ago at an election center event at their national conference. And when election officials go out for dinner, we always ask everybody, are you registered to vote? We're super annoying that way. And this young man said, oh no, I just moved here, just moved to Philadelphia a month or so ago. I haven't registered yet. And Pennsylvania had just gotten online voter registration. So this photograph is literally a picture of someone registering to vote on their cell phone. And the joy in his face is just something I like to share. I think it's one of those moments where if you were following Dean Logan, who's the Registrar of Voters in Los Angeles County, you would see things like this. And it's just another way of adding in that personal touch to some of these stories where there is a gap in understanding. We push for all these reforms, we push for voter-centric modernization efforts, but if the voters aren't aware of them, and the very first thing to get cut in any elections office is voter education and outreach. So having any sort of additional support in that is really important. And I mentioned not making any assumptions. So in this moment, voters who traditionally have liked to go to a polling place maybe won't want to. So this is a Pew study that said that 66% of the respondents said they would be uncomfortable going to a polling place. So what are their options going to be in some of these states? We know that voting in person is expanded past just Election Day Tuesday, but it's going to look different. It looked different in the primaries, right? So we don't know yet what is going to happen. We're seeing spikes in states all around the country right now. We don't know what November is going to be, but we have to start planning for it now and contemplating what it's going to look like, and really kind of leveling off the engagement of voters so that it's not all happening in the last couple of weeks before the election, because that's when it's just gets really, really chaotic. We also know that for tens of millions of voters, they've been voting by mail and had their ballot handed to them by their postal carrier, not a poll worker, for years. Obviously, the question of voter fraud and how states are engaging their voters in this moment has been, all over the news. So we're not going to talk a lot about it today. We're going to save that for a whole nother session, and that's all we're going to talk about, because I can talk about that for days and days and days on end. But real high level, the real story here are the deadlines, as well as the requirements. So do you have to have a notary? Missouri. Do you have to have a witness? Too many states there to add. Does it have to be back by election day? Does a postmark matter? Those are all the sorts of things that are really important to know. But most important, I think, is that the Postal Service, and this is before COVID, have recommended for years to mail the ballot back 1 week before the due date. So if it has to be due on election day, mail it back the week before, Tuesday before. But there are states that still allow voters to be requesting ballots. So in Ohio, we know that they can request a ballot on Saturday for Tuesday's election. And first class mail is 2 to 5 day delivery. It just doesn't make sense. The numbers don't add up anymore. So really making sure that voters understand that. And there's a resource, it's a report that I wrote when I was at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and it kind of talks about this new reality of voting by mail and has a checklist for voters who vote by mail, for legislators, election officials, a checklist for the Postal Service of kind of my wish list. And some of those things have been checked off because I wrote this in 2016. But all in all, unfortunately, it's still holding true today. And this is where we really want to flatten that curve and make sure that we're not just reporting on the last day to request something, but the first day to request it, and trying to shift all of that activity earlier on in the cycle. So in person, I will tell you right now, everybody loves a sticker. The stickers are a very powerful thing. So stories about stickers are incredibly important. There are many places that are trying out ranked choice voting and different voting methods and having stories around that and what does that mean. And some of them, it may seem a little complicated. So how can we demystify some of that and inform the voters in another way? And how is monitoring on election day going to be impacted in November? Because we know that with the CDC guidelines and the requirements on how many people can be in buildings and be in a room, if we have a number of observers, every observer and every poll worker is one less voter that can be in that room. So that comes into play also with media access. So thinking about that in this moment of, okay, there are some states where you can be in the polling place with cameras and interviewing voters in the polls. Others, it has to be outside because of electioneering laws, whereas some will let you in before the voters come in the morning. But what does that mean in this COVID moment? Will that also have an effect on the ability to get in? And there's a common theme here as well, and that is, some of the resourcefulness. This is not PVC pipe, but painter's tape is also an election official's friend. And then, of course, the requirements are always, something to reinforce what the hours will be, where the locations are, is ID required, are there ballot drop-off options in states for the first time? So post-election, I have been asked by pretty much every election official I've ever met, and I've met a lot of them, to always remind everyone that unofficial results are unofficial. They're unofficial if it's a close race. They're unofficial if the margins are huge and we pretty much know who's going to be the winner on election day. It's still unofficial. And as we move to vote centers and as we move to early voting or more vote by mail, the traditional way of reporting the percentage of precincts reported gets muddied, right? So if you have a location where you can count some of those early ballots and start processing them before election day or even on election day, some of the first numbers coming out are those ballots, not the ones that were voted at the polls on election day. So you could literally have 100% of your precincts reporting just from your vote by mail or your absentee, meaning that there's at least one ballot that's been ascribed or attributed to a single precinct, but you may not have the bulk of the ballots counted. So we really need to be thinking about how do we talk about our election results and finding out what's left. I think it's absolutely correct that we need to get comfortable with the idea that the races aren't going to be called immediately on election night, particularly in those states where they can't start processing their absentee and vote by mail ballots until election day. Not that the states are important like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and a few others. Those are the states we will not know those vote by mail ballots, and they could be the largest portion of their ballots unless they have some legislative changes over the summer. Also, this is the process for the bulk of jurisdictions around the country. It is a two-person board, literally using a letter opener and opening up envelopes and extracting the ballots and getting them ready for tabulation. That takes a lot longer than a high-speed scanner in the states that do a lot of vote by mail, where they can process thousands and thousands of ballots in an hour. But it's always important that even in, as I mentioned, close elections or not, every single ballot gets reviewed for whether or not it's eligible for tabulation. This is an old saying that many election officials use whenever we get a chance, and that is elections can be fast, cheap, or accurate, and you get to pick two and no more. And for election officials, accurate is non-negotiable. So then the question is, if you want it cheap, it's going to take a long time. And if you want it fast, it's not going to be cheap. And in this moment, everyone's going for cheap. So we're going to have slow results. And that's where we just need to make sure that stories that show, look, they're checking the signatures on these ballots. And what does that mean? Demonstrating all of the provisional ballots that are being reviewed. And what does that review mean? We're looking to see, was this person registered? Are they registered in the right place? Did they get the right ballot? Those are stories that can increase the confidence. And then there's the auditing that happens after election day. Like reconciliation audits, and that's where you look to see how many people signed in, how many ballots were given out, how many were counted. We always had an oh my God pile because when you have we had more than 1,100 voting precincts, there would always be poll workers that would make an error, and they'd make little notes. Oh, I'm sorry, we had this person sign in the wrong place, and then we found the right place and they signed there, and all of these little things that you would have to track down and make sure the ballots that everything balanced. Other places also have hand count audits, which is another interesting story to tell, where you have individuals going through and hand counting percentages of the precincts to compare them to the vote totals. And the shiny object right now that everyone is really excited about are risk limiting audits. And risk limiting audits reduce the number of ballots you have to review to get a statistical assurance that the correct winner was announced. So it doesn't say this machine exactly counted every ballot correctly. What it says is the right winner was announced. And there's some really good resources out there. Jennifer Morell, who was an election official in both Utah and in Colorado, has done 3 reports on risk limiting audits, which has kind of a background and some of the nuts and bolts, but that's also something to kind of keep an eye on. So stories to watch for 2020. What are the impacts on voters' options? So I thought this was fascinating. This was in West Virginia, and I've heard from some election officials that they're getting a lot of phone calls from voters who had requested ballots by mail, but now they're hearing in the news that it's totally fraudulent and that they shouldn't trust it, and they're starting to question whether or not they should have requested that ballot. So that's an interesting twist on some of the mis and disinformation that's coming down, unfortunately, from all sorts of sources, we'll say. Also, the impact on polling places. So we know that anywhere from a quarter to a third of the precincts facilities in many places have said you can't come back in November, and that can go, that's kind of the average. But I've heard as high as 75% to 100% of polling places in some jurisdictions, some counties, have said you can't come back. Not a single polling place will let the election official back in November. That is a huge problem, because here we are in a moment where we need actually more polling places because of social distancing. We can't put as many voting booths in. We can't put as many pieces of equipment into these facilities because they take up more room. We actually need more places, and we're having less. So that's going to be something to definitely keep an eye on. And then on staffing, both for poll workers, which we saw this in the primaries, right? Because of the age of many of our poll workers, but also in elections offices. We know that there were deaths of election officials at the county level in Georgia, in Florida, and a few other places. We know that there were hospitalizations in Fulton County and a death in Fulton County in Georgia. And here we had in North Dakota, 3 election officials said, you are not supporting me and giving me the things I need to keep myself safe and my staff, so we're quitting. That's really a problem. And we still have all the age-old problems that we've had for years, and that is, of course, cybersecurity, the confidence in the elections. Foreign adversaries are, of course, not saying, oh, everyone's got a global pandemic to deal with, we're gonna let everything ride for now. No, they're adding to the chaos. And this is really an interesting place for election officials in the last 4 or 5 years, because many offices have tried to be really transparent, and in this moment there are things that they can't talk about when it comes to some of the security. We also need to make sure that accessibility is not being bypassed in this moment. So how are people in care facilities and other places going to be well served if they are bound to that facility and can't get out? And that's what are these in-person voting options going to be? So that's another thing to kind of keep an eye on. And I've already mentioned litigation and legal intervention, and we're going to see a lot of that as we move forward. Misinformation, again, knowing what's right to identify what's wrong is the perfect example. And in the one on the right, this is actually from a news reporter pointing out that this tweet that had gone out to 5,000 people was absolutely erroneous, but had gone out to a bunch of people. And of course, it's the centennial. And so, here you have the perfect storm of both a centennial and an I voted sticker. So quickly, resources. If you are not currently signed up for or going to electionline.org every day, I recommend you do. Every single day, there are news stories being cultivated, usually by about 6:30 in the morning, both at the national and state level, of what's happening out there. What your stories are probably being shared with everyone on Election Line. It's been around for about 2 decades almost now, 18 years. And that's a great resource as a national reporter to kind of see what's happening, as a local reporter to see what's happening across your state in other news sources, but then also keeping an eye on what's happening maybe in neighboring states or states that have similar political compositions of your legislature, Secretary of State's office, that sort of thing. I mentioned the Stewards of Democracy report earlier. There's also in this moment, I'm a member of the Elections Crisis Task Force that we pulled together last year through a project for Protect Democracy. And this is one particular report that I think is of interest to everyone, Americans. And basically, it's a report on whether or not the president can cancel or postpone the general election. I did not weigh in on this report. It was done by constitutional scholars and people way smarter than me. The Vote at Home Institute also has a wealth of information on voting at home, absentee, vote by mail. The Election Performance Index at the MIT Election Data Science Lab is a way of looking at the states and comparing 17 different data points to see how they're serving their voters. How are they, do they have a lot of ballot rejections of absentee ballots? Do they have high voter turnout? And you can go in and kind of take a look at either how one state that you report on is performing over time, or you can compare it to other states or look at national kind of efforts. And so that's a great tool where a lot of the data is actually pulling from the Election Assistance Commission survey, but it puts it into a more interactive tool. Also, the Center for Technology and Civic Life has ballot data as well as elected official data, so you can, like, who's elected in a certain area. And many of these organizations have APIs and widgets and things that you can embed on your website, like the Voting Information Project, the Google Civic API. The National Conference of State Legislatures keeps track of all of the legislation around elections and is a single repository to see kind of what bills are being introduced. And then the William and Mary Law School has every state's election code in one place. And then it has the annotated election codes for, I think, 7 or 8 states now, but all 50 states are represented in what their election codes are. And then across the top, there's also a legal landscape that we did starting in 2018 for election emergencies. So it highlights what the election emergency powers are in each of the states, which can be informative. And then lastly, and I realize I've gone through, and yes, that says 100 slides, my contact information and my last PVC picture, which this is Orange County, Florida. And they started doing this when they had the television truck cables were, coming in down the hallway, and they were having a hard time getting their carts. So they used a big PVC pipe, got a hole in the wall, and this is where their television and other cables come through on election night for the reporting. So I share that just because election officials will try and come up with a solution that is low cost whenever they can, but it sure would be great if we could get them some additional funding so they could really service our voters well. So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share if that's what you think I should do there, John. Okay. And we do have time for questions. Good.
Yeah, so if anybody has a question, now is a great time to ask. But if you think of a question later after this, we have something called the Election SOS Switchboard, which Tammy is going to be on. And through this switchboard, I'll drop a link in here right now for it. And through the switchboard, you can sign up, you can find Tammy on there. And if you're reporting on a story, or if you think of questions after this that you'd like to reach out to her about, she can answer them on there. And also, if you want to take a look at this presentation, later today, tomorrow, to go back over a lot of the great information that Tammy just shared with us, this session is going to be recorded, and we can distribute that recording. And also, we can give you all access to some of the slides that Tammy has presented. I could talk to her about the best way to do that. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask. Tammy, thank you so much for that. That was great, packed full of so much useful information, and I really loved a lot of your story ideas. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, we're ready. Just unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, hi, this is Jen. This was so helpful, Tammy. Thank you for everything. I feel like you've provided 30 different stories that everybody's doing, which is wonderful. I wanted to ask if there is the report you referenced at the end around whether or not the president can ultimately change elections. That was a real cliffhanger. What's the answer to that, if there is a straightforward answer?
I think that there is a straightforward answer, and the answer is no. So November 3rd is November 3rd is November 3rd. And that's one of the pieces of all of this, is that, we've got this COVID moment, which The primary season is always chaotic. So if you've covered elections or voted in more than one state, you know that the primaries can be all over the place, not only in the day in which they fall. So it's really easy to move the day because they're all over the place, but also who's conducting that election, right? Remember 25 years ago when Iowa had their primary and they had the weird the app that wasn't working? It was actually about a month and a half, 2 months ago, but it seems like forever. The political parties conduct some of the primaries, not election officials. And so that's one of the weird things about the primary season is there is this kind of fluidity to it. That's not the case in the general. The general election is set in stone. And so that's where we just really need to, I think, to keep banging the drum that November 3rd is coming. And the way that we make sure voters don't have some outside influence in their ability to participate is that they act early. So check your voter registration now. If you move or have a change, correct it right away. Request a ballot by mail now if that's what you're going to do in the fall. And if you don't want to vote by mail or vote absentee, or you can't because you can't in all states, then make sure you're going and voting early in person. We do know that the states that have early in-person voting, sometimes they see their longest lines in early voting the last couple days. So in the jurisdiction I was in, we had a little more than 2 million registered voters. 70% of them got their ballot in the mail. And so we didn't have a lot of people that went to vote in person. But one election, we had about 25,000 people, and the sites were open for 3 weeks. Of the 25,000 people, 18,000 came in the last 2 days. It's crazy. It's crazy. So there were huge lines. People were waiting, voting at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night on the last day. And that just doesn't make any sense. If we can help to inform voters to participate earlier on, that's really going to be important in this fall, particularly, and we saw this in the primaries where those last 2 weeks before the election day, that's where a lot of the deadlines are for requesting a ballot. So people have in-person early voting. Election officials are dealing with in-person early voting sites. They have their final hiring push for their poll workers, which also means people are canceling. They are delivering equipment for election day, and they're finding out that the church is saying, no, you can't, we don't want to be a polling place anymore. And I had polling places deny the day before the election when we went to deliver materials. And then you also have the confluence of those absentee ballot requests coming in that you're trying to get processed, and also ballots being returned to be processed and counted. So a voter that waits until that time to send in an application is battling all of that other information. Whereas if you can send it in now, their application is going to get keyed in, it's going to get done, and hopefully more accurately.
Tammy, a question that I had, and I know that we've talked about this before, but the section of your presentation when you talked about, a lot of the election officials and administrators in a lot of these places, they do so many other things. Like elections are like a very kind of like small part of all the work they do, and I feel like when people hear that, like it's like kind of surprising, and I'm just wondering, like why do you think that is, right? Like why do you think that kind of like key portion of this person's job essentially isn't really well known, and I'm also wondering, how do you think that we as journalists can just make that clearer to people, just how hectic that situation is?
So I think in those instances, the smallest jurisdictions, those that are 5,000 voters or less, that is pretty much all of the way their local government is. So you don't necessarily have one or two people that have the opportunity to do, just one job. Everyone is wearing a lot of hats in small town America. We also know that that's particularly true in many of the Midwestern states because of the way in which the election structure is set up. So it's not done at the county level. It's often at the township or the municipal or the town level. So you have, 1,554 election officials in Wisconsin and 1,830 some in Michigan. So because everything is so localized, those small government units, you have a lot of tasks, whereas in many other places they have shifted the bulk of elections to the county level, and that's where you no longer have the municipal county clerk or the municipal clerk doing the election. It's now the county clerk, and so that's kind of the way in which some of that has shifted. And then you have a handful of places where it's really at the state level, where the state is making a lot of these decisions and pushing it down to the local offices. And sometimes there can be a rub there. In the same way that many states don't like the federal government telling them what to do, many local elected officials don't appreciate the state telling them how to run their elections.
Got it. Thank you for that. Jennifer, did you have a question?
Oh yeah. Sorry, I have another question, but feel free, anyone, throw in the chat or jump in. Tammy, if there's any, I know every country is very different when it comes to voting, but do you see from international elections, any other place where you feel like there are lessons that can be learned for US journalists around elections, or even just from around voting registration and whatnot?
It's interesting that you ask that, because when you look globally, Americans like to vote on everything. So most places, their ballots are not complicated. And that's why they can count them by hand, because they have two things on them. Most of the elections that I was part of conducting in Arizona, we would have anywhere from 70 to 90 different options that a voter needed to vote on, because there was judicial retention. So you had 30 to 40 judges that you needed to decide and vote on whether or not they would be retained. One year we had 19 voter initiative propositions to vote on the size of a cage for a pig and whether or not they could turn around, to legalizing marijuana or medical marijuana, what have you. There were in casino issues and gambling issues. So we like to vote on a lot of things, and that's something that is very different, I think, internationally. And that's part of the big change. There's also an embracing of many places of biometrics. I don't see that flying anytime soon, whether it's a retinal scan or fingerprints as your means of identification in some countries. So I do think that there are a variety of ways in which other countries, I'm so used to saying states and jurisdictions, other countries, and I think this came out recently. There was a study about like being a vibrant democracy, and we've fallen down on the scale compared to some other countries, and that in and of itself is interesting.
All right, we have time for, I think, one more question. So if you have one, now is the time.
I have one if it's nobody else.
Go for it.
Tammy, thank you so much. It's always great to hear you speak. I always learn so much. One question, have you, given what we've seen in the primary season so far, have you seen, and the challenges that states and jurisdictions across the country are facing, have you seen some states and jurisdictions that are really handling things well in terms of identifying polling locations, getting new poll workers, and just managing the system well, particularly states that aren't using universal vote by mail?
So that's a good question, because it seems like we've only really been hearing about the ones that have had problems, and that in and of itself is a challenge, right? Off the top of my head, I can't think of like which ones have done it, particularly well. Although there have been many things that many have been able to implement and do well. I think the states that sent out either ballots or ballot applications to their voters, the states that have allowed voters additional options and implemented things like ballot drop boxes. So Nebraska, had adopted a bunch of things that they could do there. And it's both sides of the aisle, I think, is the other important piece. and because I mentioned a little bit of some of the partisan angles to some of these policies, but there are Republican and Democratic secretaries of state that have been pushing for some of these reforms, and oftentimes are being shut down by their state legislatures. But to the voters, they get the envelope or the notice or what have you from the elections official, and they think that it's the election official who's doing some of these things. So Louisiana had some challenges that they didn't implement what the secretary was asking for, along with some others. I think that the states that are doing well are some of those that I had on the slide that have implemented modernized voter registration efforts. So those that have automated online, they're members of ERIC, they're better positioned and they haven't seen the same kind of issues with some of the list maintenance. States that, like Minnesota, where they use national change of address from the Postal Service on an ongoing monthly basis, they have more accurate voter rolls than those that are only doing it, say, every year, as required under the NVRA, and that sort of thing. But I realized that, I took a lot of time on the presentation and don't have as much time for the questions, but John is absolutely right. I will tell you, I'm available 24/7 for the most part. My contact information will go out to everybody. And whether it's, things that election officials want their voters to know or would love to have, more reporting on, or questions you have around voting system security. I've done a lot of work on that as well. Language access, how do you provide assistance to a voter in an unwritten language was something that I did quite a bit of when I was in Arizona. Braille ballots, there's so many interesting stories, at least I think they're interesting to tell. So I'm happy to talk at any time.
Awesome. Well, Tammy, look, thank you so much for doing this. And for the folks on the call, this is not the last time that you will hear from Tammy and see her amazing library in the background there. She's going to be presenting many more sessions, a couple more sessions. I don't want to say many, but a couple more sessions for us over the course of this program. If you want to keep in touch with Tammy, remember that the election SOS switchboard is something to use to get in touch with her. And also, she's dropped her contact information in there. So hit her up if you're working on a story and need smart folks to talk about the things that you are reporting on. This session will be recorded and shared widely. Tammy is here for you as a resource, as a source. She's been doing this work for a very long time and knows pretty much everything. So yes, thank you everybody for coming out. We really enjoyed having you, and please stay tuned for the next one. All right, everybody have a good afternoon.
Thanks everybody. Thanks, John.
Yep.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to talking to you all soon.